Good evening and welcome to our lecture series. I'm Milton Curry, Dean of the School of Architecture at USC and the Della and Harry McDonald Dean's Chair in Architecture. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to our fall public event series at USC Architecture and to welcome Catherine Seavitt Nordenson to our school. The USC School of Architecture is powered by the ideal to make education accessible, prepare students for diverse futures, and really to sit at the apex of a pedagogy and philosophy that is profession-focused and socially engaged. Mindful of theory, playing a critical role in advancing multiple kinds of practices, and deeply committed to the interdisciplinarity with which landscape architecture today conceptualizes its role in building culture. At all scales, utilizing a variety of tools, landscape, natural and synthetic imaginaries are now enmeshed in discourses around the role of infrastructure and technology, but also social space and reconstructing community where none existed or where an indigenous community was erased. Here to discuss the complexity of these issues and more is one of the field's most astute thinkers and accomplished academics and practitioners, Catherine Seavitt Nordenson. Catherine, it's great to see you again. Unfortunately, you're not here physically in LA, but we look forward to welcoming you to LA sometime soon. But it's great to see you again.
Thanks, Milton.
Catherine Seavitt Nordenson. Thanks. Catherine Seavitt Nordenson is a licensed architect and a licensed landscape architect and professor and director of the graduate landscape program at the City College of New York. She was born in Detroit, city after my own heart, where I spent many of my years previously before coming to USC. She was born in Detroit, received an MArch degree from Princeton University, 1996, a Bachelor of Architecture from the Cooper Union, a Bachelor of Science in Landscape Architecture from City College of New York, and a Bachelor of Science from the University of Michigan. Catherine's work really explores the adaptation to climate change in urban environments and the novel transformation of landscape restoration practices. She also examines the intersection of political power, environmental activism, and public health, particularly as seen through the design of public space and policy. Her books include Depositions, Roberto, Burleigh Marx, and Public Landscapes Under Dictatorship, a really amazing book and amazing kind of reading on great Brazilian landscape architect Roberto Burleigh Marx. Also another book, Structures of Coastal Resilience. And her work together, these works and others explore Burleigh Marx's early advocacy for the protection of the Amazon rainforest and the ongoing impacts of deforestation and the COVID-19 pandemic on the biome and Brazil's indigenous populations. Very timely work that really anxious to hear more about today. Catherine holds, as I said, a master's from Princeton, bachelor's from Cooper, and she's just a wonderful, gracious, and very smart academic and lecturer and practitioner. And I couldn't be more pleased to welcome her and to also, because I just learned her directorship is fairly new, to congratulate her on her the directorship of the landscape architecture program at City College of New York. So please join me in welcoming Catherine Seavitt Nordenson to USC Architecture. Our format will be a 45-minute lecture, 30-minute Q&A moderated by our own lecturer in landscape architecture and urbanism, Takako Tajima. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, Catherine.
Great, thank you, Milton. Thanks so much. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. It's so nice to be with you. Even though it's so far away, it's poignant. But I do very much love the work that's coming out of USC. I think there's a really nice affinity between what we have at City College and your school. So I sense a sense of companionship and camaraderie, I think, between our programs. And thank you again, Milton, for that really generous introduction. Tonight I'm speaking on the Amazon with a talk entitled Forest Politics, and I'm going to touch on some current events, but also through the lens of Roberto Burleigh Marx, the landscape architect from Brazil. But I also just wanted to note, I'm very humbled in some ways about the poignancy and immediacy of this question of wildfire, which I'm sure you look at these maps every day. And here's USC, where you are, maybe, and where I'm not, but I feel this incredible sense of, I don't know how to express it exactly, but you're sitting in the shadow of the Bobcat fire right now. This was just earlier today that I took a screenshot of this moment. And I think this relationship between us and the landscape and a drier and drier climate couldn't be more timely. This is an image from Brazil, but it could very well be California. This is from 2019. And so much of this work, which has been part of my research for so many years, feels like it's just getting ripped out of the headlines every day. Like, these are some recent stories in the summer of 2019, when the forest fires in the Amazon really started to accelerate. This was the summer of 2019. And here's some headlines from The Guardian, and then later more of these headlines from this summer, where in fact we started to see this overlay of the ongoing pandemic with the depletion and the environmental impacts of those fires. Of course, the president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, says the story that the Amazon is going up in flames is a lie. But again, reported just a week ago in The Guardian, the satellite imagery that's being gathered by Brazil's very own space agency, INPE, detected more than 7,600 fires in Amazonas, which is one of those states that makes up the Brazilian Amazon, the highest number since 1998 and nearly 1,000 more than last year. A little over a week ago, on September 1st, INPE announced that across the entire Amazon region had detected more than 23,000 fires in August, the second highest number in a decade, and only slightly less than last year's figure. And we're only in September. This is that data from INPE, looking at the number of fires burning in the Amazon, in the state of Amazonas, within the Amazon rainforest in August of this past year. What's so important to remember is that this region, this biome, is home to an indigenous population which has been there for a very long time. Here we see the Capayo protest that was earlier in the summer in Pará, and another, not a fire per se, but here's another site of extraction at Coringa and Bao indigenous land, also within the rainforest. A quote from The Guardian, also from that same article from early September: Batista compared Bolsonaro's approach to the forest fires to his denialist handling of coronavirus, which has now killed more than 120,000 Brazilians. The far-right populists hope to deny satellite images in science and project an air of normality to the world, just as he did with COVID-19. Unfortunately, this simply isn't true. At the end of July this year, there's a beautiful piece in the New York Times exploring the Amazon River and the spread of coronavirus along that conduit, addressing that high death toll, particularly in the Amazon region. In fact, in these remote towns along the river, as Tyler Hicks writes, people have been just as likely to get sick as in New York City during the height of the pandemic. And you can see some of those cases and the case counts across the river from Manaus to the west. Again, this is an old story. And I think what I'll talk about today is really looking back to that very old story about the Amazon and the river and exploration. And in fact, the suffering that these indigenous peoples have endured over so many years. A lot of this work stems actually from, not only from my book. I think the book on Burleigh Marx, which Milton referenced, is an interesting one because it covers a very particular period in Burleigh Marx's life, which in fact did not address much of the Amazon in his writing at that time. I was looking at this very particular period from 1967 to 1974. But as I was looking back into this question of the Amazon, I remembered one piece that had not been included, that I didn't include in the book, but it was a deposition given to the Brazilian Senate in 1976. So just after the end of the period I was exploring in this book of depositions by the landscape architect. And I started to think about what was he saying about the Amazon? Because I remember there being very little in these earlier 16 to 18 depositions I had been translating for that first book and using as a kind of frame for looking at his life. So with an exhibition which was held at the New York Botanical Garden last summer in 2019, I was asked to write a chapter for the catalog of this show entitled Brazilian Modern, The Living Art of Roberto Burleigh Marx. And I thought, well, I'll explore this question of the Amazon because it's just past the period I was looking at in this book. And I'm really interested in what he had to say about that because it's interesting. He didn't really address it until the late 70s. So this was quite interesting to me in some ways. And I wrote a piece. This was like around the end of 2018, early 2019. And then the fires started. And I realized I had looked at this very interesting article, series of letters, and a speech to the Senate by Burleigh Marx in defense of the Amazon, and how appropriate it seemed to review that at this time. The other thing that was going on in the summer of 2019 was the Amazon site in Queens. So this is the other Amazons. I think there's a very interesting conflux that I'd like to pose here between Amazon and Amazon. And there's an interesting long story about this. In fact, it's a 7-year legal battle between Jeff Bezos, as you know, the CEO of Amazon.com, and the 7 countries who share the watershed of the Amazon River. So for 7 years, Bezos fought a suit against these 7 countries as he wanted to essentially claim the internet domain .amazon. So he sought to essentially take .amazon as his own domain, his own sovereignty, and the 8 countries which ring and embody that, that basin of the river wanted nothing with that because they saw that as their own political geographical heritage. So the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, that's ICANN, is an independent body that vets global internet addresses, in fact, sided on Bezos's side, and he did indeed obtain the right to use .amazon as a domain. So I think this question of domain and sovereignty is very particular, but I also love this strange graphic, which I pulled from the internet, which shows you both the basin of the Amazon and the footprint of the United States overlaid for scale, supposedly, but at the same time, we start to see this strange compound layering of American interests on Brazil, which is, again, an old story that we'll touch on a little bit today. These are those 8 countries that are part of the basin. It's Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, Suriname, Guyana, French Guiana, which is a not an independent country, but still a colony of France, and Brazil. So Bolsonaro says, and this was his defense in the summer of 2019 when these fires, which unlike those in California, these are intentionally set, usually to clear land for either farming or ranching within the territory of the Amazon. But Bolsonaro says this very interesting quote to the G7 summit: Brazil will not accept any initiative that involves relativizing sovereignty over its territory, whatever the pretext and whatever the guise. That summer, we saw so many of these fires amplified during his period of his early presidency. And again, I think one thing that's helpful to look at is what exactly is the Amazon, because it's a domain now belonging to Jeff Bezos and Amazon.com. It's a territory, it's a river, it's a watershed. And within Brazil, it's also 9 states, and that's called the legal Amazon, or Amazonia Legal. And those 9 states happen to have one very confusing called Amazonas, but it also has all of these other states, which together make up the Brazilian portion of the Amazon basin. That territory and that claiming of that sovereign part of the country of Brazil has a very long history, really in parallel with the discovery and then, well, I guess the contact in 1500 onward, and the claiming of that territory by the state. And I think this book kind of says it all: Brazil and the discovery of the Amazon. not really discovered, but always there. So here we see, again, the way this territory, very riverine country, you can see this topographic map really illuminates this ability of the legibility in some ways as this place that's a giant watershed, essentially, from the ridge of the Andes all the way to the west, spreading slowly across to the east and the Atlantic. That's the territory of Brazil, and it's riddled by rivers. But this territory within the Amazon basin was always considered to be an empty place, a vazio demográfico, an empty place with no people, Amazonian emptiness. Burleigh Marx I'll touch on here and just give you a little bit of background of what I was looking at in the book, Depositions, Roberto Burleigh Marx and Public Landscapes Under Dictatorship. Burleigh Marx is a key figure in modernist landscape design and architecture. His dates, he's born in 1909, lives to 1994, so really spanning the 20th century. Photographed here in the 1970s at his sítio, or his home, just outside of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. He was a fun guy, liked to get dressed up in plants, adored plants and being outdoors, adored collecting plants. Also, he was a collector and brought many of these indigenous species of plants back to his sítio and propagated them and then used them within his public gardens. But he was also much more than just a fun and creative plant lover and designer of landscapes. He was an activist, and I think this is a very interesting side of him that was not so well known. But in fact, during the military dictatorship, which began in 1964 with American collusion, as usual, in Brazil, he is appointed, and you see him sitting in the front row here, as one of 24 counselors to that military regime on a council called the Federal Council of Culture. He's appointed in 1967. And here we see him in a very different guise, dressed in his suit and tie. And in fact, at the Ministry of Culture in Rio, at a meeting of the Conselho Federal de Cultura. And he's flanked by other intellectuals, Gilberto Freire, Rachel Queiroz, others are on this same panel. And their role is to advise this new military government on all things cultural and to actually support culture as an effort of the state. Here are three, actually this is Castelo Branco who appoints him at the head of the table. And we see the next two military dictators who are in line for that job. So he's serving this council. In fact, he's actually, as a member of the Federal Cultural Council, he's serving the dictatorship and advising the dictatorship, which we know is a hard regime. He actually serves within the darkest years of that regime, the years of lead. But it's fraught. So he's thinking about perhaps how he can use such a powerful platform to achieve his goals, which are in fact activist, environmentalist, protectionist, ecologically focused arguments about culture and landscape. And I think it's a very interesting decision that he makes, as opposed to refusing the post or leaving the country in a state of self-exile, as did Niemeyer and many others. Burleigh Marx actually chooses to remain, to serve on this council, and part of his work was to write 18 speeches to these men, which are vehement defenses of the landscape of Brazil. This is not unusual for a president to have a council. Here we see, in fact, in Trump's very early president-elect period, he brings in all of the most wealthy tech giants, and we see Jeff Bezos, actually, he's here at this meeting as well, and the net worth of each of these folks. So often there is a way that leaders pull around them a certain kind of council. And Burleigh Marx was one of those consular members. His depositions or his speeches would be transcribed and then published in this review called Cultura, which is published by the Ministry of Culture as meeting minutes, essentially. And so these were essentially the sort of prime documents that I used in the construction of this book. Each of them a speech with a particular date, never had been translated or even reprinted from their first appearances in the late 60s and early 70s. And they are somewhat like this: Defense of the Landscape. That's the title of one of his speeches. And we imagine, in fact, that he's not only speaking to this council of military dictators. Here we see Castelo Branco on the steps of the new capital of Brasilia. He's also asked to advise on the new constitution of the country, in which it is stated clearly that culture is the duty of the state. This is a military junta that was actually a very short-lived three-person, three-month moment in the dictatorship between individual presidents in 1969. And during that period, this 1967 constitution is amended, and Burleigh Marx speaks on his advice and his corrections or suggestions for that new council or the new constitution. At the same time that Burleigh Marx is serving the dictatorship in this role as counselor, in 1967, 1969, we see many, many protests within Rio. This is a photograph in downtown Rio, protesting the dictatorship and the suppression of freedom of speech and censorship. So while Burleigh Marx is inside the Ministry of Culture delivering speeches such as this one, Forest Politics and Destruction of Forests, at the same time, just outside the door, is this scene, in fact, of many, many young people rising up to protest the behaviors and tactics of the government. With this text on forest politics, in fact, Burleigh Marx is much more specific about the araucaria, or the Brazilian Paraná pine. It's a native pine species, which has been well known for over a century as a very highly prized tree for the obtaining of paper pulp. So these trees, very particular view, have been very rapidly disappearing from the country. So this is really the forest he's speaking of in many of his depositions from this period of 67, 68, 69. And he goes out to the interior of Brazil, not to the Amazon, but to the central states and the interior and the Atlantic rainforests, and is documenting that kind of destruction. But in fact says very little about the Amazon. But we know he's thinking about that, and we actually see that through his professional work. And so I'll just give you a little slice of some of his public landscapes that he designs from the 1930s through the end of his career, but particularly this highlight of this work prior to and during the dictatorship, I think is quite interesting, because this is in fact the professional work in the public realm that makes him the expert witness he is to the dictators. And I think there's an incredible knowledge that he is imbuing and actually designing with, and then using that knowledge to critique what he's seeing outside of the cities, outside of the public urban realm. And it's quite a fascinating way to sort of learn how someone becomes an expert by looking at their work and then reading their writing. And I think that was, for me, the kind of education that the book provided as I worked through the material. Here, in fact, is a very early project from the 1930s. So remember, he's not actually a counselor until the late 1960s. But in fact, he designs the garden for the building in which he'll be working as a counselor. This is the Ministry of Education and Health, which will be later named the Ministry of Culture. And he designs this very kind of archetypical Burleigh Marx plaza with the amoeba-shaped planting beds in this roof garden for the Minister of Culture's private terrace as part of that building. A very famous and well-known gouache by Burleigh Marx of this same roof terrace is shown here, of these planting beds. And again, using these very opaque gouache colors, arraying these plants, which he draws from the autochthonous Brazilian flora, so the local indigenous flora of the country. He proposes an expansion to that same plaza in the 1940s, never built, but we start to see something quite interesting here. He's using Victoria Amazonica, or the great water lilies from the Amazon rainforest, as this kind of signature image in the water garden of the plaza. And as well, he starts to use the Brazilian pine, or the imperial pine, which we see already in the history of the very early royal moments in Brazil, when King Dom João comes from Portugal fleeing the British and brings his entire court with him to settle in Rio de Janeiro, running the Portuguese Empire from the tropics. He begins the botanical garden in 1809, and those same imperial palms start to become this marker of the Brazilian cultural state. Here's another project that Burleigh Marx does in 1956 for Sao Paulo. It's Parque do Ibirapuera. He does this together with Oscar Niemeyer, whose buildings and this beautiful canopy you see in the image. The park is carved out of a former wetland which had been drained to the use of eucalyptus trees, which you see kind of fringing the edges of the park. But what he's looking at here, and Burleigh Marx's role to work with the Niemeyer configuration, is to actually start looking at the plants which are of the region of Sao Paulo state and bringing them in this ornamental way to the site. And so we see this very early use of thinking about plants from around the country starting to embody the culture of the city. And these are, again, some of the gouaches, now the perspective gouaches of those ornamental gardens at Ibirapuera, which are unfortunately never constructed. This is the plan of that same garden you saw in the previous image. Later in the 1960s, so during just after Juscelino Kubitschek completes Brasilia, the new capital, from 1955 to 1960. After that period, Burleigh Marx does some work in Brasilia, and one of the first projects he does is this zoobotanical park, where he's actually looking at plants from around the tropical belt, including species from the Amazon in this zoobotanical complex. He sees this as a tropical belt, a voyage around that equator in Brasilia. And we see again in his own drawings, here's an image of a scene from, as he imagines it, within that zoobotanical park, where we see again the water lilies of the Amazon brought to the high plain of central Brazil and Brasilia. Here are some more images of gardens within Brasilia. Again, in this case, he's drawing on plants of the Sertão, or the high plateau region around Brasilia, and bringing them to these ministries. This is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And at this time, this building's actually completed well after Kubitschek's presidency. So it's actually the military dictators who are in the presidency at this time. So he's actually being commissioned by the very government for which he's working as an advisor. So the conflict of interest is fraught. And again, you see this beautiful roof terrace at that Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and across the street or across the Great Plaza is the Ministry of Justice. Again, another water garden. These are both buildings by Niemeyer, again from the late 1960s. But perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of Burleigh Marx's work and career is his own home and his research garden, or his experimental garden, where he lives and where he collects and brings his plants at Barra de Guaraciba outside of Rio. Here's a view from a high point of that sloping site, and the colonial home which preceded his purchase of the property. He then builds a very large, like what we would call a greenhouse, but in fact it's not enclosed. It's a sombral, or a shadow house. So it's actually keeping the sun out and keeping the understory plants that he's collecting cool. It's a structure made from these, as you can see, these bamboo poles to create shade. But here he has this extensive collection of thousands and thousands of plants, which he's essentially drawn from around the country through his travels and collections. We see him here in the late 70s at Espírito Santo in the interior, just north of Rio. Here is a younger man with the philodendron plants, which he actually identified and then brought to the sítio, and then older towards the end of his career within the Sombral and his collection. So this notion of the Amazon, so Burleigh Marx also discovers the Amazon through his professional work in many ways, through the plants that he uses. He doesn't actually travel to the Amazon until much later in his career. But when he does, he actually knows the place, as do many Brazilians, in fact, through those who have traveled there before him. And this notion of the big emptiness or the vast unknown is really the narrative that we often see of these early explorations. And so again, in this construction of the expert witness that is Burleigh Marx and that he draws upon as activist, knows this history and cites this history. He knows who comes before him and he knows how to make an argument to the future. So I'll trace through a few centuries of travels through the Amazon to think about who owns the Amazon. Perhaps the most interesting early explorer is actually a colonist, but born in Brazil, Alexandre Rodrigues Ferreira. So during the period of colonial Brazil, he's the first one to actually travel up the river and create a collection that is sent back to the crown in Portugal. Ferreira is actually educated in Coimbra in Portugal. He's born in Brazil, travels back to Portugal for his education, then at the request of the crown, begins this expedition again up the river Amazon, and creates this incredible documentation of the things that he sees on his journeys, and even documents the indigenous peoples who are in the forest itself. So he's not only looking at the plants and the animals, but the people who live there, debunking that idea of the emptiness. Later, we see this very interesting expedition, now a European expedition of two Austrians who come along with the wedding party of an Austrian princess marrying a Portuguese noble. And they're invited by the crown to actually travel again up the Amazon to create a catalog of Flora Brasiliensis, or the flora of Brazil. This is Carl Friedrich Philipp von Martius, who is the author, together with Johann Spitz, who is a zoologist. They travel together. And again, you start to see these similar lines of travel, again, very riverine. This begins in Rio with the arrival to the wedding. And we see this travel up along the eastern side of Brazil and then along the Amazon into each of its tributaries. And with this collection, it's an extensive, exhaustive catalog of all of the flora, highly documented, of these regions in Brazil. But what von Martius does that is so fascinating is this creation of these phytogeographies, or he starts to make this argument that in fact, the plant life and the geology are totally interrelated, that things live and multiply. It's a very early and very smart approach to what we now call ecology, or a household of nature. He sees these things as working in tandem. So he creates these views throughout the country. This is the area of the hills, the granite hills just outside of Rio at Serra dos Orgões. But here we see a drawing of the Amazon as well. And he really does this incredible view. They're views, but they're also geologies and plant-imbued geologies that he sees as living together harmoniously. And we know that Burleigh Marx is fascinated by these drawings by von Martius. He cites them many, many times. And this is a drawing by Burleigh Marx, very clearly inspired by some of the work in the phytogeographic views of Martius. Euclides da Cunha is a very interesting character in the story of the Amazon. He's mostly, or most well-known, I should say, he's the turn of the century for a novel called Rebellion in the Backlands, or Os Sertões, his most famous novel about an uprising, a kind of monarchist uprising in the backlands of Brazil at the time of independence from that monarchy. But just after that novel, in fact, he writes, or that sort of historical novel, I should say, he takes a trip up to the very far western reaches of the Amazon territory over basically piggybacking on an expedition that's off to chart the actual border with Peru. So there's a conflict in those western realms of where is the border and where does one territory or sovereignty begin and one end. And he writes this story, The Amazon Land Without History, about his travels through that region, which is actually very well known for the high quality natural latex rubber, which is tapped from the trees. Here's another explorer a little bit later, so just after that expedition that Da Cunha has joined in 1905. In 1907 through 1916, Candido Mariano da Silva Rondon creates this expedition, or commission as it's called, to, on the one hand, lay a telegraph line from Cuiabá to Santo Antonio. So in fact, this notion that you could start to create connections into this deep, unknown, supposedly unpeopled territory of Brazil, to connect that deep hinterland to the coast where the populations and the city centers were. So this is a notion of connection that essentially foreshadows the constructions of roadways and highways, which will come later to snake their way through the Amazon as well. But the laying of the telegraph line was so much more than an infrastructural project. It was actually seen as a kind of scientific endeavor as well. So in the spirit of von Martius in many ways, Rondon goes together with a botanist and they collect plant life. He brings a photographer and a filmmaker along, and they capture images of the peoples who are living within the forest as well. And you can see on this map, which shows the line of the telegraph, all of the names of the various nations that they encounter along the way. And what's quite interesting is Rondon is himself half indigenous. So he has a very curious affinity in some ways with the native peoples that he's encountering on this expedition. And you can see the clearing of the forest for the line of the telegraph in this image, these beautiful glass plate negatives that were produced as part of the expedition. Here are some of the telegraph stations along the way. And we see his botanist, Carlo Hueni here, and an encounter with one of the tribes within the basin. This is Rondon. By 1930, there's a new president. It's Getulio Vargas, who will be on again, off again, really until the end of his life in 1954. But his first series of presidencies is from 1930 to 1945. He too is a dictator, and it's in this period around 1937 that his presidency shifts to the new state, or Estado Novo, and he begins this very aggressive westward march, the march to the west, encouraging pilgrims or migrants to move to these less populated sections of the interior, particularly in the Amazon region as well. This same initiative is echoed later by Castelo Branco in the 1960s, after 1964, with Operação Amazônia. So again, another militaristic title for this idea to populate and make productive the landscape and the territory of the Amazon basin. And here we see the new life in the Amazon. There's a lot of propaganda that comes with the Vargas aspect here, and the rubber tapping is one of those key roles that can be played in terms of making money from the forest. Here's the roadway. The Operação Amazônica is including the Trans-Amazonica Highway, 1967. So again, this is under the dictatorship, with this great clearing, which has echoes of that telegraph line that we saw with Rondon. More views of that construction of the Rodovia Trans-Amazonica in the 1970s. Here we see the two presidents, actually President Ernesto Geisel and his subsequent, the next president in line, together create this highway. And again, during the period where Burleigh Marx is just about to, he's just left the Federal Council of Culture and is about to make this very important speech in 1976. So this is the year prior to that speech. But this overlay, which I I like to think about very carefully of the United States on the Amazon is more than just this graphic that shows us scale. There are indeed Americans who arrive in the Amazon, as they will, to gain profit. And the first is Henry Ford, who creates Fordlandia, a company town, and a rubber tree plantation in the eastern part of the Amazon basin along the Tapajos River near Santarem. And you can see from this aerial view the construction of that rubber tree plantation and factory to produce natural latex for Henry Ford's tires in the car industry. This fails. Rubber trees aren't particularly amenable to being planted in plantations. They actually thrive separated from each other in the wild, and part of that is due to a blight which travels along the leaf canopies. So when they're close together, the blight travels very quickly. So that was actually a collapsed industry, and shortly thereafter, vulcanization was invented, and there was no longer a need to acquire the natural latex. We see also Daniel Ludwig, another American millionaire, who starts a project called the Jarry Project. Again, the notion to create a plantation, this time for cellulose, for paper making, not for latex. But he initiates this with the blessing of the military dictatorship in Brazil in the late 1960s through the 80s, and in fact constructs an enormous cellulose production factory in Japan, which is then floated all the way to Brazil and up the Amazon to land at Jarry here at Monte Dourado. And you can see in the Brazil Today weekly news magazine, the American invasion, even contentious at its earliest formations. Burleigh Marx also is aware of the Jarry Project and against it. And we see evidence of this in this little etching that he does, where he writes, "Get out, Ludwig, fora Ludwig, Jarry, merda, fora, 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 you traitor, you filha da puta." So he's very much working already in this activist mode against these notions of the Amazon as a place to clear, as a place to gain profit, as a place for either Americans or others to profit wrongly from what is otherwise a ecology which should not be disturbed. Ranching is another very critical industry, let's say, that has started to, has continued, let's say, to displace the rainforest as well. This is really why we're seeing so many fires which are intentionally started in Brazil today. It's to clear the forest for ranch lands and for farmland. And you can see in this image, the cattle, which are actually at the base of this forest. The castaña tree is protected, so everything around it can be deforested and cut down, but that tree must remain. In the early 1970s, Wolfgang Sauer, so another multinational corporation, he's the head of Volkswagen do Brasil. He's a German man who's living in Sao Paulo and running Volkswagen Corporation in Brazil, decides that he would like to actually begin a kind of cowboy ranch, let's say the Fazenda Cristalino, or a ranch in the Amazon as part of Volkswagen's interests. So this ranch begins in the 1970s. This is really the story where Burleigh Marx starts to come to play in this conversation about the Amazon and to speak out. The headquarters are in Sao Paulo. There's a long history of Volkswagen in Brazil. We see President Kubitschek in the back of a Volkswagen Bug here at his election day, and also together with a very young Wolfgang Sauer at the presidential palace. This is the president and the executive of Volkswagen do Brasil. So this ranch, in fact, was begun with the blessing of the dictatorship. Again, this is in the 70s. A territory is cleared in this eastern part of the Amazon, and the ranch is established. So we see the cows. This notion is that you could actually start to use this empty land to produce meat, protein, crops, and the argument made to help the people of Brazil. This, of course, is quite fraught. The employees are not paid properly. There's essentially slavery going on at the ranch. And it too will collapse quite soon. But in its early years of ranching, interestingly, this is where Burleigh Marx steps in. And he actually is indeed responding to some things he has been reading in the international press. But he brings a speech to the Brazilian Federal Senate in Brasilia in June of 1976. So this is now 2 years after he has stepped down from the Federal Council of Culture. But interestingly, he's responding to word from the Americans, in fact, who have launched Skylab, which you might remember from the 70s. And Skylab has picked up an image in the Brazilian rainforest of smoke and announced this to the Brazilian authorities that there's a very large fire in the Amazon. So Burleigh Marx is aware of this, and he actually comes to the Senate and says, Volkswagen do Brasil has started a fire the size of Lebanon within our forest. And he's vehemently angry about this. And he cites, interestingly, von Martius and this sketch, which you see here, one of the phytogeographic views produced in that Flora Brasiliensis. But in fact, it's an image that is the only one that he produces that is a nighttime view, and it's of a clearing of a territory through fire. This is an old practice, and so we see it throughout the colonial period. It's used by the indigenous peoples. The idea that you can essentially clear a forest through fire to produce a territory which can be used for agriculture. So this is a known technique. But Burleigh Marx very cleverly says there were Germans who fought against this, because in fact in von Martius's text, he states, how could this be done? How could this devastation of the landscape be permitted? And he calls out Sauer, who's a German national as well, and says there were other Germans who thought quite differently about the landscape of Brazil and how it should be treated. And quite interestingly, he also during this speech, he identifies the multinational companies that have been supported by the dictatorship to do what they will in the Amazon, and says that that kind of deforestation, in fact, the law at that time, the forestry code, permitted a landowner to clear 50% of the territory of trees, and they only had to maintain the other 50%. And then they could do whatever they would like with that cleared land. So this was Volkswagen do Brasil's intention in their Cristalino ranch in the Amazon. Burleigh Marx exaggerated the scale of the fire, but however, would not back down when he was called out by Sauer's, in fact, PR person, who wrote to him and said, you should retract that statement about a fire the size of Lebanon, because it certainly wasn't the size of Lebanon. And he writes back directly to Sauer, and I'll quote very briefly a part of that letter from July 8th, 1976, so a month after his speech. He writes back saying that he won't rescind those comments that he made to the Senate, and he writes a very articulate argument in defense of nature in a personal letter from November 4th, 1976. And he says, I will never make such a denial. I don't believe in selective trained fires. In addition to weeds, it is likely that the fire also burned noisy macaws, filthy armadillos, vicious jaguars, venomous snakes, certainly large trees, and perhaps even some treacherous Indian. Do you know that shrubs and other types of forest that you mentioned were the objects of admiration and fascination for such illustrious Germans as Martius and Humboldt, who traveled to the Amazon in the 19th century? And by 1810, Martius, outraged, denounced the massacre of such precious flora. You have to understand that it is my obligation to oppose everything that I consider an ecological crime. The sacrifice of nature is irreversible. So he's essentially stated, Burleigh Marx is essentially saying there is an ecological genocide that has been committed by Volkswagen do Brasil. And in fact, that has shifted the pendulum swing in some ways to recognize that the Amazon was something so much more than a place for profit, a place of undeveloped territory that would be willingly sacrificed to exploitative international interests. He really identified that territory as an ecological and cultural resource, drawing on his Federal Council of Culture arguments of the previous years, and an asset that should truly belong to Brazil. Its so-called demographic emptiness, or the vazio demográfica, was not empty at all, and its ecological biodiversity was measureless yet vulnerable. And we see with those constructions of the roadways of the beginning in the 70s, the threads of deforestation that occur along those lines within the forest. And again, along the spine of the Amazon, we've seen the virus start to move and devastate the populations of indigenous Brazilians who've already suffered so much at the hands of the contact civilizations which have come before them. So I find it quite interesting at this moment where we find ourselves again facing these fires that are politically lit in some ways. What do we do and how do we make a statement as eloquently as Burleigh Marx did in the 70s? And with that, I thank you so much for the invitation to speak and for your attention. Thank you.
Hi, Catherine.
Hi, how are you?
I'm sorry, earlier on I had trouble. I had technical difficulties. I couldn't hear anity.
Welcome to Zoom.
Thank you so much for the really chock-full lecture. You covered everything from sort of politics, ecology, to botany, to was biography. This was really, really great. I guess one of the things that the format is this, if there are questions, so far there aren't any questions, but if questions emerge, I will sort of field them and sort of moderate them. But I'd like to start selfishly with my own questions. And I guess you talked about all the sort of, numerous decades of different entities coming in and basically, trying to make money off of the Amazon. And clearly, right, that's part of the big reasons why the fires are happening now, because there's an interest, obviously, within the country to profit from the Amazon. And I guess it got me thinking, and I sort of wonder, what you think of this, especially in light of what was announced by actually Jeff Bezos in April with the fund, right? The fund to help, I guess, American forest owners or owners of properties with forests get in on carbon credit trading. I guess I'm wondering if, because I think there's a right for the countries that have parts, pieces of the Amazon to, accumulate wealth. And so I'm just wondering, if, you've thought about ways in which these countries could benefit and profit from, basically having a piece of the Amazon within their country without destroying it.
It's a great question. I think that shared aspect is very interesting, because despite the Burleigh Marx is really positioning his claim of sovereignty as a Brazilian one. So he's no different in some ways than the current president, in that he's claiming territorial domain, right, over that forest. And it's specifically as this Brazilian cultural heritage. So unlike Bolsonaro, he's not looking at it as a way to profit or to brush aside the inconvenience of indigenous peoples who happen to be on protected land. But he's making the same sovereign argument. And this is where I think that's the key, and why it's quite interesting to consider the polity of the 8 nations that are part of that shared watershed. Yes, Brazil's the biggest of them in terms of land area, but they all share the watershed. And I think that there's something that's greater than state that is the real key to how this could be unraveled. And is there a way of thinking about, the greatest engine of carbon capture, which is in fact that rainforest, which is at this tipping point where it will collapse and be unable to sequester the carbon that it does. And how that relates to profit in our capitalist world is the real question, and how it can be started to be reconceived in some ways as something that's beyond sovereign territory that belongs to a nation. There's got to be another way to quantify value in a way that's more shared and that connects. I think I've made the argument that the equator and the poles are totally connected. There's a way of understanding melting ice and burning rainforests as a singular problem and not one that's particular to a territory on the globe. I didn't answer your question, but
I'm actually, I'm wondering, because like I think I'm pretty crude and so I've been wondering, right, is there a way, for instance, these 8 countries to be like almost like the OPEC nations of the carbon sink, and then to sort of, benefit financially from that, so that there would be sort of an incentive to maintain, the Amazon. And so that tie between, I guess, Jeff Bezos, I mean, I don't know why he doesn't give that money to the Amazon, people in the Amazon to begin to partake in the carbon credit trading that, he's proposing for these small landowners in like Vermont. But I just have been thinking, and it's sort of ironically, right, or maybe like sort of, the OPEC nations, right, sort of developed as these discussions were happening in the 60s.
Yeah,
probably.
That's right.
So I'm just, I guess I'm like crude, but I'm also like sort of hopeful and optimistic that, that the value placed on forests, as basically Jeff Bezos has done by, creating this fund, would continue and would, begin to sort of give leverage to these countries right now who some of these, like Bolsonaro, who thinks it's an inconvenience to have to sort of protect and manage the forest, instead to think that actually, there's a huge benefit to it, and that it comes with some kind of a price tag, so that there is an incentive. So the questions are coming in, and let me see if there's, let's see. Okay, maybe. Well, this is like, I mean, in some ways, this is like sort of what we were talking about, but, really pointed. What is your opinion, outlook for global protection of the Amazon? It's a big question.
Yeah, I'm looking at these too. Yeah, so it's my outlook. I know. Those who know me know I'm an optimistic person, but I find it so, it's so pessimistic right now. It's really difficult to figure out how to get to where we need to be. Let's look at this though. It used to be deforestation was worse. It was worse. And so we're seeing, I could show all the graphs, but there was a moment around 2004, I think, where it really started to peak. And then it came down. And part of this was this separation in Brazil's government of, well, the creation of a ministry of the environment and separating that from the Ministry of Agriculture, when before that had not been. In fact, the agricultural ministry had domain over the Amazon. So to see it as this place of crop, right, or culture in terms of extraction, whether it be agriculture or forestry or even ranching, there was a moment where those two things pulled apart. And now Bolsonaro has layered them back together again. So that's why we're seeing what was in fact a good period where deforestation went down, and now it's spiking again. And I think that that's partially that that conflux is what's really caused the collapse of the valuation of the environment that's fallen with the rise of the agricultural ministry. I suppose that's one way of looking at it. So what is my outlook? I mean, it's really, for that to be a successful protection, there has to be some way, I think, as you're saying, Takako, is creating value within the maintenance of the forest, right? Or the fact that it's something that is indeed inherently valuable as it is, as opposed to as it might be. And I think there's always been this Brazilian imaginary of, expansion, colonialism, moving people, these colonies into these places which were uninhabited to fill that empty void, which we know was never empty. So I think that there's some very interesting questions there. It really has to be this kind of ethical and I think, fundamental understanding that it has to be different. It has to be somehow valued in a different way.
Right, like a shift in perception, totally. So I guess you can see the questions. So I mean, like,
I see them. Which ones do you like?
I mean, I guess
there's more. I haven't seen them all.
There's
oh my gosh,
more
there's
below
many more.
too.
Sorry.
Yeah, they're coming in
because
now they're like, I think they've had time to sort of like, let their brains sort of like.
Yeah, I'm the same way. Well,
I think,
let me try this one. Alexander Robinson. Do you identify strands of activism in his formalist designs? Is his built design work activist? I think this is really interesting because everybody throws around that word activist right now. And I just did too, so I'm totally guilty of that. And I have identified Burleigh Marx as an activist, but the question is, can you be an activist designer, or do you do that through politics and policy? I think this is a kind of great question. And I'll say one thing, and it's not, again, I'm not really, I think there are strands and we could unravel them possibly. On the other hand, he was trying to make a living and support his office, right? So I think there's this one side of Burleigh Marx is this sort of visionary environmentalist, and there's another part that needs to pay the bills. And he's very, he writes about that too. So there's this need to sometimes just have clients for clients' sake. And then there's the public work that he does. And he's very specific in the public work about what he intends, how he wants these parks to be a place where people can see their culture. They can understand regions beyond where they live. They have this access and this space. It's almost Olmstedian in some ways, a space for health against the stresses of the city. Like, he uses language like that. But, and this is the big but, and this is another one, like those little things where I'm grappling like post book, like, oh no, what did he think about the Amazon? Or wait, there's something needling me. And the needling thing, which I'll put out there, is this really interesting disparity or question of how can you be both socially activist and environmentally activist at the same time? And I think in Burleigh Marx, he was not. And I think I've shown you a few clues where you see like there's an issue with, people who are oppressed, who are marching outside the window, and he's in his suit and tie talking about the forest. And so there's a disconnect between a sort of social activism or social and human rights, which seems to be at some level, at least for Burleigh Marx, incompatible with the environmental activism. And it's a little bit of an elitist view that he was unquestionably in the Brazilian elite, yet he's an immigrant. So he's born to immigrant parents in a country that values very long Portuguese names that can be traced back to the crown. So he's a very interesting character in that way. But I think a few things that I found in some of the depositions, I'll just talk about two. One was a condition where he was defending the sort of nursery garden above the botanical garden in Rio, which was being tapped by the government as a site to build public housing. And he said, no way, you can't put housing. It was essentially this notion that the government could create a housing territory which would start to replace some of the favela constructions nearby that would actually provide proper housing for the poor. And he says, not on my seedling forest. So you see these kinds of things where the right to housing is trumped by the right to a historic seedling garden of the botanical garden of the king. So that's one example. Other ones are, protecting or landmarking the hills around Sugarloaf, right? That where we were starting to see, at the time he's writing, favelas creeping up the side of the hill. And so there's that other thing that says, no, this is a protected landmark. You can't build your self-built houses there. That's not for your kind of people. This is the cultural property of the state. And so that you start to see this disconnect between that sort of housing rights question that comes up quite a bit. And I think there is this, overlying all of this, he gives these depositions, he has very clear demands. He's like, I want this to happen. And if you go and check and see what happened, he's like about 30%, he gets about 30%. And so how much of it is the kind of elite of the dictatorship tolerating the elite of culture to let him speak his mind and not exile him or punish him or torture him or imprison him, but not answer his demands. And so I think there's a few things where it's not all good. It's not all good. And I think we see that to this day with these questions of landscape, putting landscapes into trusts that can no longer be, to maintain a view or a scenic place, usually for a wealthy elite. And so I think there's some really interesting questions. I like that question a lot because it makes me think about what does it mean to be activists and how do you act on these kinds of questions when there's things that butt heads. It's not easy.
Well, I think I want to take some questions from students, the ones that I know.
Please do. Yeah, I don't know who's.
So we have a question from Laura. So can you talk more about any examples you have of development done well or managed well? And I guess this could be related to managing natural resources or even, I guess, development.
Yeah, Halprin. I mean, I feel like Halprin, you've got some good people in California. Think about Sea Ranch. I think there's some very interesting development in the landscape that occurs there where you maintain this notion of the collective. I guess that's really what he was about. Collective views or collective access or collective waterfront, as opposed to the kind of privatized mind thing that you get. So I think maybe that's one example. I'm losing her question because there's so many anonymous people out there. My goodness.
Yeah, people.
But yeah, I think that's maybe one notion of where you see something sort of well-suited. Some things that Burleigh Marx really railed against. He hated this move that would often be made where, given that loophole in the forestry code in Brazil, where in fact it was legal, let's say, to deforest half the land, what many companies would do, they would buy that land, deforest half of it, and plant back some really quick growing pine species, non-native pine that they could just use for paper pulp. Not that indigenous one, but others. So he really hated that. And so there was this notion you can't, he was already kind of anti-greenwashing. You can't just put back a forest in the place of an old growth forest and call it a day or call that sort of good management or planning. I think that's another way of looking at that question. Yeah.
There's a couple, I think, I mean, some of these, there's some couple of activist questions, which I think you've sort of covered. Let me see. About, okay, there's a question. Let me see what Hannah is asking. That is married. I don't know if you want to take either Hannah or maybe also Luis's question could be something. Hannah has a follow-up question.
Yeah, I think I totally see where you're going with that. I mean, it is a question. And I think I put my finger on it.
Say it. I'll read it out loud for.
Yeah.
So
I'm sorry. Yeah.
First question was, what do you think American environmental activists could glean from Burleigh Marx's appeal to culture to protect the rainforest? And then there was a follow-up. I specifically meant the intersectional environmental activism that is emerging today that encompasses environmental justice and social justice too.
Yeah, it's different. Yes, indeed. I mean, I feel like what's very powerful in today's environmental movements and the climate marches that we were all part of last year when we walked, in a different, without our masks, let's say in that period last year at this time. Yeah, there is this very clear overlay of social environmental justice questions that Burleigh Marx did not have. And I think that's where I find some of his writing troubling, because he's not able to make that parallel. Whereas today, like we see everything from should you eat meat? Should you, what are the questions of the environment that are affecting so many other things? And with BLM, and as we see now in the Amazon, and the very disproportionate percentage of the population who is indigenous that is impacted by the COVID, there's something very wrong going on. And so I think what's very interesting now, like I like this observation that today there is something else. The question about culture, I think that was part of your question. Yeah, culture's loaded. And I think what was very, like, whose culture? Because I feel that there was a very specific culture that the military regime defined and brought in a council of experts that they selected to advise them on culture. And again, as I think I said in several of the constitutions, there's been like 8 in Brazil, they rewrite them quite a bit, but there's always, in the most recent ones, there's always this clause and it says, culture is the duty of the state. So that's something we have to question, because can we trust the state to define our culture, and whose culture is that state defining? And I think that what you're seeing here with this intersectional question is like, is culture the right thing or the right word to use, or is it too imbued with power? And is it not open enough to see a multiplicity of positions or places? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. This will be the last question. Luis's question about exploratory. So Burleigh Marx's practice drew much influence from discovery and conservation. How do you think this exploratory preservationist approach resonates within landscape in our current information age?
Yeah. I don't know that I kind of often draw this, the current information age. He's not really you have to distinguish between preservation and conservation. And conservation, I put it in that Pinchot camp with the greatest good to the greatest number. Burleigh Marx was on the preservation side, so more like John Muir, let's capture it and look at it and it's beautiful and don't touch it. So he had much more of that sort of frozen view, despite his very progressive ideas about what ecology is as a kind of complex of things that we're living in dynamic. It was still a kind of capturing. So this notion of he didn't really want to have conservation in the sense of Pinchot, that we should use our resources and replenish them. That wasn't really his position. So it is a preservation, let's call it like a preservationist discovery. So finding new things, going out, naming things after oneself, right? So he has a lot of plant species named after himself. And what is the, I mean, it's very curious. I mean, I think in the current, I'm not quite sure how to respond to the question specifically about the current information age, but I think that there is something that is quite different in terms of like, what is the native plant? You know, that's really off the table these days. We really have to think about things quite differently in terms of like nativism and culture and country, so that it's not so neat and tidy, because we're such a fluid species and totally interconnected. I think that's one question, like that notion of I will use all native Brazilian plants in my gardens and make my people better falls a little suspect today. I think that's not really what we're after. At the same time, it's not about let's have one of everything, you know, to create this sort of multi, you know, species garden of delights in some ways that pleases all. That's also quite different. So I don't know if that answers the question totally specifically, but hopefully that helps a little bit in terms of where he was and how we position ourselves today. Oh, look, Milton just appeared like out of the background. Hi. That must be a signal or a cue or something.
Keep going, keep going.
That it's getting later and later for you,
Yeah,
Catherine, so we have to
I'm
wrap it
still
up.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I think that was, I think it's so rich with the layers of history, aesthetics, politics, I think, as Takako talked about. And I think we're just, you know, very indebted to you for the time this evening with us, and look forward to having you here in person to be on reviews and meet with our students. It'd be great.
I would love that. And send me a copy of those questions, because I didn't even get to read them all. But they're great questions. I really appreciate the sensibilities of the students that are coming through here. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Takako. All right.
Yes.
Have a great night, everybody. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Everybody,
Bye. Thank you.